So just to say, I'm really delighted to be here. It's just great to be here. Such a lovely place, a fantastic centre you've got. This room is just so wonderful. It's the first time I've seen the shrine, the new shrine. The last time I was here, the Buddha was in bubble wrap. He just arrived in bubble wrap, so it's really nice to see the Buddha enthroned on the shrine there. Really lovely. Yeah, so I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm going to talk about imagination. I'm going to talk about the elements of imagination, and I want to just try and take us one step at a time. And then after the talk, which I'll try and keep an eye on the time, we'll have a bit of questions, and then we'll break up into groups to talk about the talk again. So one of the things I've been doing, one of the things I've done recently, is I created a new venue at the London Buddhist Centre, which I've called Poetry East, and I'm developing it now into Lit East. I'm trying to make everything East eventually. So there'll be Art East, Lit East, eventually Science East and all that sort of thing, but I won't be doing the science ones because I don't know the first thing about that. The next event we've got, for instance, is Con Toynbee, the Irish novelist, is coming, and I'll be interviewing him, and he'll be reading from his most recent novel, which is actually a novel about the Virgin Mary. Anyway, that's another matter. So in my last Poetry East that we ran, I interviewed the poet Don Patterson, a well-known Scottish poet, very, very good poet. I very much recommend his poems. They're not easy to read in some ways, but they're the best, I think, as sort of contemporary classics. And I was very struck by him. He's very influenced by Buddhism. In one interview I read, he even said, "I agree with the truth of the Dharma." I think this is a description of the human situation and what we should do. So, of course, in the interview I said, "So why aren't you a Buddhist?" As you do. And he said, "Well, I don't like to follow rules." And so I said, "Well, is Buddhism about following rules?" And so we went on. But one thing, he's a very, very intelligent man, a very cultured man. A very talented poet, a very deeply thinking man. One of the things that I was struck by in my interview with him and in my reading of his critical writing is he really wants to emphasise, as he puts it, there's no one here but us chickens. I think it's from a song, there ain't anyone here but us chickens, I can't quite remember. But it's something that for him is very important, so he wants to really emphasise that, there's no one here but us chickens. What he means by that is any time that I'm writing, any time I'm giving a talk, any time I'm writing a poem, I'm writing and talking to other people like me. There isn't anybody else here. Especially he means that there's no supernatural agency. So there is just us chickens. And I have a lot of sympathy with that view, obviously, that there's no one here but us chickens. In the sense that there's no God, there's no supernatural agency, there's nothing that can save us. All of those are stories made up by us chickens. I have a lot of sympathy for that. And when he writes, particularly, he's just written a very good book on Shakespeare's sonnets. And the striking thing about his book is he writes it very informally, just like he's chatting to you. So he'll say things like, so-and-so says this poem means this, but I've got no idea what it means. And it's rather refreshing. And I think that comes out of this sort of, look, I'm not talking as a scholar, I'm not talking as a scholar to other scholars, there's no one here but us chickens. So I'm just saying, here's what I think about this poem, and I've read what other people have said, and here's what they say, and see what you think. It's rather refreshing, I thought. It makes him unpretentious, it makes him straightforward, wonderfully intelligent, not least. And very direct. So what struck me about this comment is, it's one of those comments that we make, and which we all might make, and which on the face of it seems ineluctably true, that there is no one here but us chickens. And it feels very sensible, it feels very down to earth. It feels the sort of thing we need to hear in these wars nowadays with religion, and the wars between religion and science. I think it's very important sometimes to say there's no one here but us chickens. But as I thought about it more, of course, as you think about it more, you start to ask questions of it. So I don't think that quickly. I certainly don't think as quickly as Tom. But of course, there's two obvious questions that come out of, there ain't anyone here but us chickens. And the first one is, how do you know? Isn't it, really? How do you know? And of course, the answer has to be, I don't know. Actually, don't know. Nobody knows. It sounds very commonsensical, doesn't it? I'm not criticising Johnny. I think common sense is very important. But what struck me was just my reflections from it, because it sounds very commonsensical. It sounds very real. It sounds very practical. At first you sort of don't question it. But of course, the first question is, how do you know? And you don't know. He doesn't know. I don't know either. And you don't know either, just to make it clear. Just to polarise with you, for no good reason. But we don't know. That's our assumption. There's no one here but chickens. It's not the Buddhist assumption, really, as far as I can see. Buddhism assumes that we're in a world which stretches off into universe after universe after universe, with life on all those universes and with Buddhas even on those universes. I've been re-looking at the White Lotus Sutra, and you've got this incredible vision, this cosmic vision of universes stretching out from us. And then Buddhism assumes that in this world, as it were, that we're in, it's kind of multi-layered. That, yes, we're existing on this plane, but there are other planes of existence that, as it were, intersect with this plane of existence, but which aren't visible to us. So it's expressed in Buddhism in terms of things like, mud spirits, tree spirits, water spirits, gods, demons, and so on. The Buddhist assumption is not that there's no one here but us chickens, but there's chickens and, cats and ghosts and all sorts of things living on different levels, sometimes even communicating with each other. According to Buddhist sutras, the Buddha taught the Devas. What that means for us, I don't know. Our modern sophistication wants to dismiss it. But one possibility is he, as it were, taught on other levels during his sleep. And I don't know the truth of those things, whether we are living on different planes. I know people whose veracity I don't have any reason to doubt, who seem to have experienced things that seem to take place, as it were, on different planes. Some people seem to be particularly even tuned into that. Unfortunately, I'm not. I'm from the Midlands. I won't allow it. Anywhere around Birmingham, you just can't have any visual experience. And if you do, you have to move. I did move, but I still haven't got any visual experience. When I first started meditating, I did have a vision of Christ on the cross, which is a bit embarrassing because it was the wrong image, but retrospectively, I think I made it up. Anyway, but I know people who definitely experience things which you could say on another plane. Bante himself has had lots of experiences of all sorts of things that don't live on this plane of matter, if you see what I mean. I remember talking to her, I said, well, you seem to have had lots of these experiences. Bante said, oh no, I know people who've had much more of these than I have. So Buddhism, and lots of people's testimony, of course, that's questionable, suggests that we're living in a universe quite different to this common sense idea of us there being no one here but us chickens. And even, of course, modern science is saying, isn't it, more and more, that what matter is much more mysterious than we thought. There's still this great problem about how does the grey matter in our head create all of this? How does the brain create this whole experience that we're having now? It's called the big problem. So we don't know, folks. That's sort of my first reflection, is actually, when he says there's no one here but chickens, you don't actually know that. You believe that. Yeah? It's a belief. It's actually a sort of religious belief. It's a belief that's forgotten it's a belief. We've so grown up with that belief, we're so naturalised to it, that we take it to be a fact, but we actually don't know. It's certainly not a scientific fact, because science has pushed the boundaries out of that, away from that. It's an assumption, it's a belief. And it's fair enough to believe, it's one of many beliefs, but it is a belief, it's not a knowledge. Yeah? But then my second thing I wanted to say to him, if I could think of it quicker, was, what's chicken? What's a chicken? I mean, that's the really problematic thing, isn't it? Is what is a chicken? So, okay, let's just say, for argument's sake, there's no one here but us chickens. What's a chicken? What are we? Nobody knows, do they? I don't know, and you don't know. In fact, the more, as I get older, I don't know whether you experience it, but as I get older, I seem to know less and less. But nobody knows what us chickens are. Even if there is only no one here but us chickens, nobody knows what we are. So we don't even really know what development for chickens looks like, because we don't know what a chicken is, if you see what I mean. I hope you're following me. You guys are going to talk about imagination. I've ended up with a long discussion about poultry. Anyway, well, I'll try and move from poultry. I think this is really important, that we don't know what we are. We don't know what us chickens are. We've got all sorts of ideas about what we are, but we don't know. We don't know what consciousness is. We don't know what dreams mean. We just don't know. You name it, we don't know about it. So, of course, Buddhism would say, when, what are we, what are chickens? It would say that as chickens include this, that whatever it is we are includes, or potentially includes, a state of mind, a state of being that we can't really imagine, that goes completely beyond us. So do you see what I mean? As soon as you think that's what we mean by chickens, do you see how when we say a statement like there's no one here but us chickens, we have a whole raft of assumptions, beliefs, views, which sit inside that assumption. And that set of assumptions doesn't include Buddha, it doesn't include a figure that, according to Buddhist tradition, 2,500 years of Buddhist tradition, has completely gone beyond his chicken nature. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? The Buddha, after he was enlightened, he's met by someone, and this person said, "Crikey, you look, there's something about you. You seem to see that you seem something quite special. What are you? Are you an angel?" And it's a deva. And the Buddha said, "No." And "Are you a god?" And the Buddha said, "No, I'm not a god." Interestingly, the person says, "Are you a human being?" And the Buddha says, "No." And I presume what he means by that is I'm not a human being in any way that you can imagine it. I was born a human being, just like you, but my consciousness as I experience it, is so changed. My motivation, my whole motivation for living is so utterly different as you can't imagine me. So Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of our movement, says it would be better to think of the Buddha as a species unto himself, a new species unto himself. So what us chickens are a species that can give rise to a new species unto ourselves, which is quite incredible. It offers a potential for what we are that goes well beyond our Western sophisticated assumptions, goes even well beyond traditional religious assumptions, because so often what you end up with a religious assumption is that you have an ideal like God, you can never become God. In Buddhism, of course, when you don't become God, you become more than God, actually, effectively. Anyway, that's a discussion point. So it's striking, isn't it, when you start to think about a commonsensical statement. It has all sorts of views, it has all sorts of values, all sorts of beliefs hidden in that statement, even though it looks perfectly reasonable and commonsensical, and indeed it is. But nevertheless, it's written through with belief, and they're not Buddhist beliefs. And I'm not necessarily saying you should have Buddhist beliefs. I'm just trying to say, just see how we're caught in a moment. There's a kind of parochialism in time as well as in place, and we all tend to be guilty of parochialism in time. We tend to think that this time has got it sussed. And probably every time has thought their time has got its stuff. So yeah, in the old days, people used to be very superstitious and a bit silly, but now we know better. And of course, in 100 years' time, people will think that of that now, just as we think of the Victorians as being well-meaning but fundamentally flawed, people all think the same of us. So we have a sort of parochialism in time, and we forget that. We always think that we sort of know better, and we don't. So it's interesting, because really the where we want to go with this discussion, first of all, we don't know that there's no one here but chickens. That's just a view, it's a belief, and it might be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but you can't know that. You can believe that, you can't know that. And then you'd need to then, even if you have that belief, you need to then define what does us chickens mean? What does that pertain to? What can that be? And in Buddhism, the vision of that is very, very grand indeed. So grand, it goes beyond chickens altogether. Yeah. But there is actually a faculty, obviously, which I could have found a way, hopefully, of talking about, and which he would, immediately relate to, which is this faculty of imagination. It's a faculty in us that goes beyond us, or at least has the potential to go beyond us, if we understand it deeply enough, and if we imagine this world, imagination, in a greater field than we normally do. It seems to me that if we were to look in the West for a precedent in the West to Buddhism, it wouldn't be in the Western religious tradition. You wouldn't find precedent to Buddhism, the Western religious tradition. You'd find it in the tradition in the West of the imagination. That's really the ground out of which contemporary Buddhism could grow, I think. I think we're still in that process. So by imagination, so I need to do lots of caveats, and let's try to time you out. So by imagination, I don't necessarily mean image-making capacity, your capacity to imagine things, images in your mind. I'm also not particularly, I am actually, but I'm not. I don't particularly mean the arts. I'm a bit of an arty person myself, so I venture into the sciences, but I was going to say next to nothing, but really just nothing. Friends of mine are much more knowledgeable, and that's not difficult. So I will always use the arts as my example, but that's just me. Imagination is not something that's just owned by the arts, as it were. In fact, a lot of the so-called arts aren't imaginative. It's just as true of science, the best of science. It's true of the best of all human activity, including things like the best of human communication. The best even possibly even administration, I don't know. But I just want to make it clear that by imagination I want us to remember that it's a faculty we have which is expressed in all sorts of different aspects of life. It tends to be discussed in terms of the arts primarily, which creates problems because it starts to look a little bit to do with arty people, and sometimes it is, and frankly sometimes it isn't. So we have this faculty of imagination which goes beyond the arts and literature and so on. So I want to try and define the imagination a little bit, try and get a clearer sense of what I mean by the imagination. And then I want to try and talk about some of the elements of the imagination. And then hopefully we can have some bit of time for questions, so we can try and think a bit more together. I frankly think that there's a lot more to think about this, and I need a room full of people to think about it. Hard luck. The imagination, the most important thing to say about the imagination is the faculty that we have that goes beyond us. We know when the imagination has been, whatever happens to the imagination, discovered, revealed, when the imagination, as it were, steps in, and the tradition in poetry has been the image of the muse descends. We know when the muse descends, as it were, because what is produced in that state goes somewhat beyond our usual sense of ourselves. In a way, that is axiomatic of imagination. It always goes a little bit beyond yourself. If it doesn't, then it's not imagination, it's something else. There's always something a bit unfamiliar about it. There's something new to it, not new in the novel sense of being unusual, but new in a deeper sense, which hopefully I'll gradually flesh out. So I always think it's better to think of an example. So my example, which I've used a lot, it hasn't been too much, is when I was painting at art school. So I was doing a small, highly coloured painting that I used to do in my little studio at Goldsmiths. And I'd done these drawings in the park. I'd been listening. I had this mad experience. I thought I ought to start listening to opera. And I'd heard that Tristan and Isolde, Wagner's opera, was the highest point in opera. So I thought, well, I'll start there. Got my Sony Walkman. Does anyone remember those? Very pre-technology. I got my Sony Walkman, went out from my art school, and just has a park over the road, and I had this little pad of coloured paper, and there I was. I plugged in my Sony. If you ever heard Tristan and Isolde, it sounds like there's a woman screams for about half an hour, and then a man and a woman scream for about half an hour each, and then two men scream, and then a woman screams. 6 hours later, you listen to the, I just can't believe this. I mean, it's like so over the top, you can't believe it. So there I was plugged into this screaming, which I've come to think, it's an opera I go back to again and again. It's an incredible thing. I mean, an absolutely incredible thing. There I was listening to this piece of music for the first time with my coloured pad and doing these little drawings. And I had this experience of sort of ecstasy. It felt like the music, this little group of trees that I was drawing, and my hand moving across the page all joined together. And the drawings seemed to just do themselves. I never draw. I think it was the first time I'd sort of drawn things sort of, I was sort of, before then I was trying to be a political painter. I'll laugh, because I didn't know anything about politics even. And this is the first time I thought, for heaven's sake, let's just go and draw some trees. Rather than talk about the sinking of the Belgrano. Actually, I didn't have any experience of, and what on earth was I talking about? I was only about 13 of us. So I thought it would be better to start with some trees. And then these drawings just came out of me. It's like this little they took minutes each, I just drew in this kind of ecstasy. And I put them all on my wall. And I started doing these paintings from it, and all the last part of my time at art school was paintings from these little drawings. And I was doing this one painting, and I was sort of struggling away with it. And if anyone has painted seriously, it gets to a point where you really do want to throw it out the window. Cézanne famously, you get into a complete rage with one of his still lifes, and you just hit it out the window. And then it would get stuck in an apple tree, and he'd have to get his son to knock it down with a stick, and then it'd start it again when it calmed down. So I'd got to the throw it out the window stage, and I was on the 3rd floor, so I could have done. And I remember thinking, okay, look, let's get the sky sorted out. So I just painted out the top of it. And as soon as I painted out the top of this painting, something happened to the painting. You could feel this kind of movement, this kind of something new. It's very difficult to describe, but you know it. You suddenly feel like something's happening, something's alive, you're onto something. And this is exactly the same, presumably, as scientists think, and when they're thinking about something, and suddenly there's something alive in the idea, or there's something alive in the proof. I've been talking to someone I know who's a mathematician who's talking about working on proof. And I painted out this guy, I thought, okay, we're onto something now. And the only thing that was problematic was the bottom right-hand corner, as so often is the case in paintings. Bottom right-hand corner is way so I thought, okay, there's something wrong. And I had this little bush in the bottom right-hand corner. And I thought, it's too bright. So I make it dark. No, it's not too bright. So I scraped it off. It's in the wrong place. So I moved it slightly to the left. No, not that way. And I moved it slightly to the left like that. And it just went click. It seemed to just go click. And there it was, the painting finished. It was an incredible experience because there I was, and then I knew, that's it. hands off, into me. And I knew it immediately, instantaneously, that this is now a painting. Before it was lots of me trying, now it was a painting. A very, very odd experience. The first time it really happened to me very strongly. And I sat back and looked at this painting. A very strange experience, because every single mark on that painting I'd made myself, every colour I'd mixed myself. There wasn't anything in front of me that I hadn't done, and yet there was something else in it. There was something new in it. There was something I didn't recognise in it. It had a deeper purchase on life somehow. It had its own life. It was as if it started to look at me. It's as if it started to pose questions to me. It started to... I'm talking far too long. It started to talk to me. Very, very odd, because everything on it I had done, and yet there was something that went beyond me in it. This is what all artists yearn for, is this experience of something beyond us. I really like part of a poem by Wallace Stevens. He says, "A tune beyond us, yet ourselves." It's a brilliant condensing this point about imagination. It went beyond me, and yet it was sort of the completion of me. It was a tune beyond us, and yet ourselves. I didn't realise how much there was to me, if that's the right metaphor, which I'm increasingly not sure it is. It's as if I didn't realise that there was that much to the world, or to the universe, or to life. Very, very interesting experience. So that's a good example, I think, from my own experience. And I need to find examples from my own experience, otherwise I just think they're just clever words. But that's an example from my own experience, of a definite experience of creating something which went beyond me. Yeah? So that's the main thing about the imagination, is it goes beyond you. It's something new, it's something you don't recognise. It's a tune beyond us and yet ourselves. It's a deeper purchase. Where do I want to go from here? So let me just give you a few more examples. So recently I went to see Hamlet again, the play you see again and again. It was an unusual production. They sort of telescoped it quite a bit. But what struck me about the play again was how incredibly unified it was. The metaphor, the language of metaphor in the play is so wonderfully wise, and the themes of the play are constantly being mirrored, being answered to. There's a kind of call and response across the play. So it's just one thing. You just couldn't have done that. You couldn't have thought that. You couldn't have written that. So it's just too wise to write, if you see me. It has this incredible unity. Shakespeare must have written that and thought, good heavens, there it is. Where did that come from? It's a really, really good one. I've done a really good one. It must have got to put it out there and what you did. But anyway, so the first thing I want to say is it goes beyond us. The second thing that coming out of that is that going beyond us is new. It's new in this deeper spiritual sense. It's not new in that you've come up with something new. That's a kind of mock version. And I want to say something in a moment about fancy, because this thinking about imagination, Bantu's thinking about imagination, is actually relates to Coleridge's thinking about imagination. The reason why it's new, the reason why it goes a bit beyond you, at least one of the reasons we can understand at least, is because it represents the unification of feeling and thought. It represents, imagination unifies our thinking faculty with our emotional faculty. So that to think is to feel, and to feel is to think. Only with that unification do we have this energy, this new kind of energy, to go beyond ourselves. Without that, you just don't have the gas. You can't do it without that. You can't think it. You're not clever enough. And even if you are clever enough, it shows that you're just doing it because you're clever. Some people are wonderfully clever, but it's not necessarily imagination. So yes, it goes beyond ourselves. It's new, and that newness is only achieved by this incredible integration of thought and feeling. It creates a new sense, a new us, effectively, a new wisdom. And in something that is genuinely imaginative, some deeper purchase has been made on reality. Some deeper unifying vision has been discovered, which you couldn't have done without that faculty. And this is just as true for Einstein's theory of relativity as it is for, I don't know, Titian's paintings, as it is for Shakespeare's sonnets, as it is for Emily Dickinson's poems, and so on, as it is for Lorca's plays and so on. You need this sort of faculty to take you into this new world. And it's just as rigorous. One of the things about the imagination is that the new perception that the imagination reveals is incredibly intelligent, but intelligent in a deeper way than you could ever be. That's why great art, particularly, has created so much secondary discourse, as it's called, because the perception that's discovered by the artist, by the writer, by the musician, by whoever, by the scientist, by the philosopher, is incredibly unified, incredibly perceptive, a new perception of the world. And so it breeds masses and masses of secondary discussion about it, which never gets to the end. I can't remember how many books are on Hamlet, but there's an incredible amount of books on what that one play. And somehow you can go and see it as many times as you like, and you never quite feel you get to the end of it. You always feel, oh gosh, that's a new illumination. So those are some of the aspects of imagination. I want to say a bit more about these elements of imagination in a minute, but let me just define it against fancy. So this is Coleridge. He talks about imagination, and he talks about what he calls fancy. Probably what we call fantasy. And fantasy or fancy is a near enemy of imagination. It's what often stands in lieu of imagination, but isn't imagination. Often it does actually very well. I'm a bit aware of the contemporary poetry world, and sometimes I think it does very well in that world because it looks very imaginative. It stands out a bit, it's rather novel, it tends to attract your attention, it tends to have imagination written all over it, which is a sure sign, frankly, that there's not much imagination. I mean, if you think, one of my great heroes is Cézanne, and he manages to do more with a few apples on a box than most painters have done with, palm trees and angels and elephants and every imaginative thing you can come up with. So fancy then, in Coleridge's thinking, is it's really the same old thing in Brand New Drag, to quote Iggy Pop, just to show that I can have more contemporary references. It's the same old thing in Brand New Drag. It's the artist or the scientist or the thinker just taking the usual stuff of experience, but putting it in an arbitrary way, putting it in a kind of arbitrary, rather attention-grabbing way, in a way that says imagination. So if you're writing a poem, you'd write a poem about a stick of underarm deodorant, a zebra, an orange, your mother, and the war, and you'd write about all those things. It's just the same old, but you mix them up in a way to make it look imaginative. And what Coleridge is trying to do here is he's trying to make the distinction between that and imagination. So he's trying to say, well, there's some things that look imaginative that aren't. I mean, actually, there are some things that look imaginative and are. You can never quite pin this down. And I think probably the distinction in practice as a practicing writer or artist is not as clear as it sounds. But yes, nothing new comes into being with fancy. It's just you still. And you feel it. When you try to write from fancy, you can be very clever, you can be very elusive, you can be sort of brilliant even. But it's just, you can feel it's just you. It's just the same old thing. Of course, you then have this more contemporary idea of fantasy, which is really just wish fulfillment. Pornography is the most obvious example of fantasy, and in pornography it's just sort of wish fulfillment, isn't it? Obviously you probably define it now against that as well, but it's not kind of wish fulfillment. It's not just wishing that you were, I don't know, younger, sexier, whatever. It's something quite beyond you. It's a new experience. So that starts to hopefully clarify what Bhante Sangha actually means by imagination and what Coleridge means. So let me just go through some of the elements of the imagination to try and flesh it out a bit more, and then let's see whether there are any questions. So I've already said a few things. So I've said that imagination is a faculty, just like your eyesight or any other faculty. It's a faculty we have. It's a faculty we all have to a greater or lesser extent. It's not just owned by artists. In fact, it often isn't owned by artists. It's an experience that goes beyond us, and yet is somehow a completion of ourselves. Feels like, at last, I'm really living. When you are truly imaginative, you feel yourself to be fully alive in a new way. And I think the other experience we have of this is in communication. You know what it's like sometimes when you're chatting to somebody or talking to somebody. So often it's just you, isn't it? I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to people. And so often it's just me, I just sort of say, and giving talks like this. And so often it's just me saying the sort of things I say, asking questions that I'm not always frankly that interested in the answer of. Just saying the things, I think, trying to oil the wheels of social intercourse. You know what it's like, don't you? You sort of sit there and you want to have a meaningful discussion, you want to meet somebody genuinely, but the things you come out with are just you. And it's rather tiresome and frankly a bit boring. If people don't know you, they don't know your jokes, they don't know your stories, they're a bit interested at first. But frankly, it sort of soon wears off, doesn't it? But sometimes in communication, something happens, doesn't it? Something happens between you, which seems to be more than you, attuned beyond you, and yet yourself. And in those experiences of communication, it's very, very deeply satisfying. You feel that was this thing called communication. Can't quite say what was communicated, but something new came to be. Something that went beyond just the sort of things you say and just the sort of things they say. That together you became more than the sum of your parts. And when you experience that, it's quite definite, isn't it? You know you experienced it. You couldn't necessarily say what it meant, but you know you'd had it. It can just be slightest interaction somehow sparks it off. Sometimes not, I think that's one of our direct experiences of imagination. And again, the experience is that it's not just you anymore. It's not just a tired old me that I repeat. It's something new, So it has this element of newness always. It has this going beyond ourselves, attuned beyond us, yet ourselves. But it has these other faculties. So, and I've touched on some of them, but sometimes it's better to go through them sort of point by point. So it always has this aspect of discovery. So the imagination is always something you discover. You can't be imaginative. There are no such people as imaginative people. You can't be imaginative. I can't be imaginative. As soon as you try to be imaginative, frankly, you're not being imaginative. You can't do it. It's like trying to be spontaneous. As soon as you're trying to be spontaneous, by definition, you're not being spontaneous. So you can't be imaginative. What you can do is create the ground out of which imagination can be discovered. So an act of imagination is always discovered. You feel you discover something, and what you've discovered is a deeper purchase on life, a deeper truth, a deeper perception. But it's always characterised by discovery. A friend of mine who's been mentoring me as a poet, she said, when you're writing a poem, if you haven't discovered anything, you haven't written a poem. Simple as that. If you haven't discovered it, you haven't written anything yet. There needs to be discovery for imagination to come in. So that's the first one you could say after my sort of description of imagination. That's the first thing you need to look for is discovery. And to discover something, you need to be receptive, you need to be doing your bit of the work. If you're a philosopher, you need to be thinking. If you're someone communicating with a friend, you need to be turning up, you need to be listening, you need to be trying to take an interest. You need to do all the work, but something needs to be discovered if it's going to be imagination. If it's Einstein, you're doing the proof. So there's discovery, and then there's this sense of unity. This is my second point. You experience a new sense of unity. This is what I was trying to say about the Hamlet. I put it in the wrong place. But there's this incredible sense of unity. Again, Don Patterson, in one of his critical essays, was saying that a great poem is like just one word. It's very, very, that's that way of putting it, that a really substantial piece of poetry particularly is characterised by this incredible sense of unity. It's like it's just one word. Everything in the poem mirrors each other, unifies, echoes each other in this incredible dance. That it's just one thing. It has an incredible sense of unity, which is a kind of rich unity. It's not a sort of homogenised whole. It's something much more, much richer than that, which you could not have done yourself. It's just too hard. There's too many things at play to do it. You need this new faculty to discover this unity, and that needs you to have your thinking and your feeling integrated. Any work of art worth mentioning, any philosophical work worth mentioning, is a work of unity. So, for instance, I was reading a while ago Brian McGee's books on Schopenhauer. Really, if you want to, you can discover philosophy. I'd really recommend Brian McGee's books. He's a brilliant person to describe difficult ideas. And he has a wonderful book on Schopenhauer. And one of the things he really at pains to point out is that that Schopenhauer himself says, this is just one idea. Schopenhauer says, okay, I've written 2 books, The World's Will and Representation, part 1 or 2, I can't remember now. And actually it's just one idea. And to understand that one idea, you have to read all of this book. And he'll even go, okay, we've done this and this and this. So before I add a new thought to that, let's remind ourselves we've done this, this and this, because it's just one idea. So any philosophical work worth its salt, it's got this sense of unity. You can't do it outside of the imagination. And that unity takes you into depth. It's that unity that discovers depth. You can't do it. It's just too difficult. You can't do it with your mind. You just can't do it. So you've got discovery, what I've been calling the metaphor of discovery. You feel that you've discovered something. You've got this sense of unity. And then you've got this sense of aliveness, what I've been calling the metaphor of aliveness. And as I said about my painting, in my own small way, and I'm not making claims to that painting, it's not a great painting, but for me, it was a movement beyond me. It seemed to be alive. Suddenly it was alive from its own side. And this is again a feature of the imagination, that when imagination has appeared, has been discovered, that the thing becomes alive from its own side. It seems to somehow start to cross the boundary between self and other, so that the object is invested with some of the qualities of the subject. And sometimes it's really spooky, this. I don't know, you have to be very receptive to feel it, I think, but I remember looking at a bust of Brutus, I think, by Michelangelo in Florence. It's about that big. And it's quite roughly done, the hair's just sort of chipped in. And you look at, you see lots of busts, kind of heroic busts, and they're 2 for a penny. You look at this one and it's just alive. It's a bit of stone, and yet it just seems to have something more to it than a bit of stone. Of course, you have to be receptive to that, to allow that to yourself to experience that, but it seems to me uneluctably true that you look at it and there's something looking back at you. There's lots of myths about this, about the sculpture you make that then becomes real. They're all trying to get at the aliveness that you discover in imagination. Sometimes it's positively spooky. It really feels like and elements of the subject have become part of the object, as if the stone is animated. Of course, one can sentimentalise that and so on, but there's a real truth in that, it seems to me. So you get this metaphor of aliveness. The thing itself seems to be alive in some way. Even seems to be conscious of you in a strange way. Even if it's the artwork that you've made, or the theory that you've come up with. It's as if, perhaps I don't know enough about science, but Einstein's theory of relativity, it's almost as if it then becomes conscious of Einstein. I mean, he has to work out what on earth is this saying about the universe. Yeah. So it's got this element of aliveness, and then it's got this dimension of ascent. Ascent, I think, going up. When I was talking in Spain, I've been translating, and they translated it as an ascent, as in a smell. So we had this metaphor of a smell, and everyone was obviously waiting for how this was to do with the smell. So I'm in an ascent. But imagination has within it, and this is where, I hope, by talking about this, I've basically talked about the Dharma, you see. I've basically talked about what Buddhism is trying to get at. I've used thoroughly Western language, but that's really what I'm trying to talk about. This element particularly draws that out. So the imagination can ascend. You can start to experience a new, this tune beyond us yet ourselves, which keeps sort of kicking off beyond itself, if you see what I mean. It has this capacity to ascend. In fact, it's built in, this element of ascent, this metaphor of ascent, is built into imagination. When you feel it, when you discover it, you feel yourself to be taken up. Sometimes really quite literally, that you're in a new world, a more refined, larger, bigger world. You feel yourself to be taken up. And sometimes you even feel it when you're giving a talk. You can feel that you're kind of taken up. And everybody in the room kind of feels that as well. They can feel something coming in. Sometimes it's just you giving a talk, the stories you tell, and sometimes something comes into the room, a tune beyond us, yet ourselves. And when you're teaching like that, it really feels as if you're just mediating this imaginative faculty in the room, and everybody can feel it. It's very, very striking. Those of you who've done ritual, there are times when suddenly a ritual becomes like this, where suddenly someone will say, that was a good puja we did last night, that was a good ritual we did last night. And what they mean by that is this dimension of ascent has stepped in. You know, again, I mainly know this from the artistic world. So, for instance, Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus, he wrote them in, I think it's something like 2 weeks. I can't remember how many of us, 150 of them, can't remember, doesn't it? And he said that it was like a period of divine dictation. He just wrote them down. They're hardly corrected at all. They're rhyming sonnets, very, very difficult form to do in a sequence. Very metaphysical. He said it was just like taking dictation. He said he'd never had an experience like it. Just one after another, sometimes 2 in a day. They're thought to be these great masterpieces. And he'd just write them down. Mozart famously, he would have the whole symphony appear in his head in one moment, and then he'd just write it out. You know, he'd just have to write the whole thing out. Sometimes in a carriage on the way to the pub. Just writing the whole thing out. So there's no way of accounting for these kind of experiences, but to have this metaphor of ascent. For instance, Bach's cantatas. You wrote them, they would perform on a Sunday, you'd write them Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, his wife would fair copy them, they'd rehearse it Wednesday, Thursday, whatever, and they'd do another one on Sunday again. And I think there's 254 of them or something like that. Many of them are great masterpieces. Nobody could do that. It's just would kill you to try and work at that level. There has to be something beyond yourself that is working through you. And Bhante famously experienced this, didn't he, when he was giving these talks in India, where he gave talk after talk after talk. And he can barely remember it, of what he said, and yet these talks he gave had this incredible effect on all the people he was speaking about. And then at the end of it, he said it was just, he felt perfectly happy and relaxed, like he'd just had a real holiday, and yet he'd never worked so hard in his life. So there's no way of explaining these experiences apart from this sort of metaphor of ascent. Something quite new comes into being, which you can live in. and keep ascending through. Eventually this becomes nothing less than the sacred. The great problem, I think, of this language of imagination, and perhaps I'll finish with this, is we have this dreadful tendency in the West to reduce things. So Coleridge, when he was trying to talk about imagination, was trying to flesh out the very meaning of life. But we've ended up with this thing that we call is just the imagination, something that we stumble upon, which we've mixed up with fancy, which we've mixed up with entertainment, which we've mixed up with, this is nonsense really. So we end up with this very restricted idea of the imagination. So the danger is when we talk about this in terms of spiritual life, it reduces it, but this quality of ascent takes us into what we have to call the sacred. And what I think we need most in the West, what human beings need more than ever now, what I need, frankly, is some contact with the sacred. I'm remembering Don Patterson, so I don't mean some supernatural agency. I don't mean a literal other, a god or gods. But I do mean the sacred, a tune beyond us, literally beyond us, and yet ourselves. The capacity to live beyond us, as the Buddha lived beyond us. In a way, what you get in the Buddha is the Buddha represents the final goal, as it were, goal and final in very inverted commas. He represents the apothegm of ascent. He represents living in the ascending imagination all of the time. But what you've got in the Buddha is just this ascending imagination, constantly ascending all the time. So that every time he meets you in this completely clear, open way, a new way, which must have been, frankly, terrifying if you met him. So that's what I've wanted to say. Somehow, the imagination is a faculty we have. It's a faculty wherewith we discover what's beyond ourselves, what's beyond us, there just being nobody here but us chickens. It's the faculty which most of all is what's going to take us on our spiritual life. It's a faculty that includes discovery, it includes unity, includes aliveness, and then finally takes us into this ascending world of imagination that the Buddha represents.
Thank you very, very much. Do you want to have a period of question and answer?
We could do, yes.
Yeah. So, any questions?
You were saying about communication, how sometimes you can think about when you're talking about things that in communication. Do you think it's about, I've come away from it sometimes, I thought, did I just feel that? Do you think it has to be both people that feel that?
Maybe we should
just... question about repeaters.
Yeah, so the question was, well, Maitreyabandhu talked about that happening, that sort of something new coming into existence in communication. And Terry said, well, do you think, she's had that experience, but she was asking, well, do you think that the other person also has that experience?
Yeah, because I want to say that they go, well, but if they haven't...
What if they haven't, what if I've just imagined it or something?
Or was it just something
I don't know, it's a good point there. I mean,
is that the person coming in? Does the other person have to...
I don't know if they do have to. Depends how receptive they are. Usually they experience you in a new way. I think it's probably quite rare that they haven't seen us and stepped in. Although it's possible. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud as usual, but, people did meet the Buddha and thought, yeah, that's a nice enough guy. Or even polarised with it. But that can't have been because he wasn't this ascending imagination. It must have been because they weren't open to him. So it's quite possible, if it's quite possible to polarise with him to just think, yeah, seems all right. You know what I mean? To be, which is even worse in a way, just to be non-committal about it. It must be true of us, at every level. But generally speaking, I think both people experience it to some degree. Perhaps one experiences it more than the other. Yeah, so I don't think you have to experience it. Both people have to experience it. I might think more about that, but I don't think so. So often it's helpful to go back to the Buddha and think, well, what happened to him? Because he's the ideal of it, he's the guide of it.
Last question. What do you think is the connection between imagination, as you're describing, and meditation at its best?
Yes, I should have talked about meditation. Well, it's interesting. When I started writing poems, a friend of mine said, "Oh, you've got a head start because you've meditated for so long, and it's not fair. You should start. You should hold yourself back." And I think that's right. I think. Well, the primary thing is that imagination needs to be integrated. Genuine imagination comes out of your direct experience. It comes out of your experience of your body, your experience of your emotions, your experience of the life around you. A lot of what we call thinking is kind of what I call mid-air thinking. We're thinking from our thinking or from what other people have thought, rather than. And I think we do that so habitually we don't notice it. Our thoughts we have, our imaginings, are just really based on other thoughts and other imaginings we've had, if you see what I mean. So they're starting in mid-air. So genuine imagination is rooted very, very strongly in the here and now, in your body, particularly, I think, in your emotions. It's actually to do with you deeply perceiving life. And meditation, one of the many things that meditation does, is the royal road to integration, I think. Mindfulness is the royal road to integration. But that limits meditation too much. Meditation is itself that imaginative journey. I think what you are trying to do in meditation, whatever meditation is discover the imagination, which often is discovering what you need to do next in the meditation. It's when your imagination comes alive in meditation that your meditation is a meditation, I think. So I think there's those two things. Firstly, that imagination is grounded in direct experience, and you can't be imaginative from mid-air. The poets that I've really thought very highly of, for me, are clearly poets whose work comes from direct experience, isn't just sort of confected, constructed out of mid-air. Another contemporary poet that is very, very noticeable with is Seamus Heaney. His imagination is incredibly physicalised. It comes out of direct experience. It's not kind of cleverly floating in mid-air. But I think both. You've got as a path to integration and as an unfolding of imagination. For many of us, that's going to be where we experience the imagination most. And imagination can never be corralled. So, whatever practice we're doing, mindfulness breathing, Maitreyabandhu, if we're an order member doing our sadhana, you're always looking for how does this meditation deepen? And you have to keep on discovering that. You can't be taught that. You need to learn the lessons of meditation and all the techniques of meditation, but just like a singer would learn her craft, his craft. Could go to master classes. If it was an opera singer, they'd be going back again and again. They'd never finish learning, would they? But a singer is always, I think, looking for, in the moment of performance, something new coming in. A great singer suddenly finds a new way of doing that phrase that they hadn't been taught. And it's something to do with their own personal history, and it's something to do with the magic of the moment, which is also to do with their relationship with the audience, I think. So I think meditation's like that. You learn all the art, and we need to keep learning that and deepen our learning of that, and perhaps even learn more rigorously. And then we try to find out where our own personal history and the ascent of imagination crosses over our learning and find a way of taking us up to that new level. So meditation is never finally a technique. It includes technique, but it's not exemplified by technique. Yes,
a question around trying to formulate it. How would you apply it to, as well as meditation, our Buddhist practice in daily life? Is there a way that we, what happens when our imagination meets our Buddhist practice in daily life? What would that look like or feel like?
Well, it's good you also, because this is the area that I think I need to think about more. What about this, folks? And what about, I don't know, driving home? And what about making breakfast? What about all of that stuff, working on a computer? How does imagination come into that? I mean, more and more it feels to me, and I haven't thought about this properly or deeply enough, is that what we are is an instant of imagination. That somehow that's what we are. So when we say, what are us chickens, really we would have to say that we are imagination in a more or less active form, a more or less blunted form, a more or less creative form. I don't quite know about my thinking here, but let me just go on for a bit and we'll see where we get. That's what I think, is that we are an instant of imagination. I got to this because once I was writing, I think in one of the first book or something, I was writing about meditation and this awful idea, frankly, I hope I don't upset people, this awful idea of being in the moment, which one of my great tasks in life is to smash that idea. I think it's an idea without content. Anyway, that's something for your discussion. And I was trying to think, because actually if you look at the order, frankly, and if you think of the order members being people who exemplify being in the moment, you'll be really disappointed, folks. It's just not true. Yeah? And I don't think it's Buddhist either. I don't think Buddhism teaches that. Once I talked to Bhante about it, and he said, I've never heard any Buddhist teacher teach that. I said, I've heard plenty of people teach that. But Bhante thinks it's not a Buddhist idea. I think it's actually just an idea without any content. So I was trying to write about it, and I thought, this is nonsense. I was trying to write about, that's why I was trying to say that meditation is about being in the moment. I thought, well, that's just nonsense. What on earth do we mean? I just don't think it's possibly true. What then I thought was actually more true to say we're imagination. That what we are, even the fact that you're sitting listening to me now, and as I'm trying to bumble my way through this answer, in inverted commas, you're needing to, it'll only work for you to the degree to which you're imagining me. You're trying to think, what's it? You're doing that, aren't you, all the time? It's sort of feeling that's what you're trying to imagine. What am I getting at? Because these words are just words, aren't they? They're just this sort of strange, symbolic set of things that human beings have developed, at some pain, to try and talk about life, which isn't words. Do you see what I mean? I think we've got so enamoured of words that we really think that life is encapsulated by words, but remember, folks, that experience comes first and words came second. Words are always an attempt to flesh out experience. This dreadful postmodern idea that there is just words, it's just nonsense, isn't it? I've worked myself into a ladder. So you're just like, I must stop doing it. So you're, the very way that you're trying to, the way that we can communicate is because I'm imagining you, what you need me to say, and you're imagining me. You see what I mean? Like, for instance, if you just saw somebody light a cigarette and you'd come from Mars, you'd no idea what that meant, would you? Just as an observation, you go to someone's room, they open this pack of lights and they put it in their mouth. You've no idea, it could explode, you've no idea what it does. Would you? You'd have no idea. So from your direct observation, you've actually no idea what's happening. The only way you know what that means is if you've done it, or you have a sense of, you imagine what that would mean. Otherwise you think, that's really weird. They're inhaling this smoke and then blowing it out again, and then getting this funny kind of expression. It's like really weird, isn't it? You think this person might be mad. They're lighting something which is like really dangerous, and then they're putting it into their mouth. You'd have no notion what that means. To understand somebody lighting a cigarette or walking out of a room, you have to imagine it. I remember once seeing somebody put their coat on just over their shoulders and pull the collar up and walk out of the room. And I thought, just that, I know why he's doing all that, but that's nothing to do with my observation. So I know what it's like to be moving from one building to another, and you don't want to be a bother to put your hands in. You know what I mean? So you go, well, I'm only going across the courtyard, so I don't need to put my hands in. That's a big bother. You know? So you just put it over your shoulder, that dreadful 70s like sort of way film directors used to do. And it was snowing outside, so you know what it's like to get snow down your neck. It's really not a pleasant thing, so you pull the collar up. But you don't know any of that from seeing the action. It's only because you imagine it that you can understand what that action means. So do you see, that's what I'm trying to say, is that somehow our very experience is imagination. So whatever we're doing, whether we're working on a computer, somehow it's to do with our imagination, what we're imagining. Like, it's incredible, isn't it, how now we, for instance, expect photographs to appear on the screen. I remember when you pressed photograph, very, very gradually, somebody's face sort of appeared whilst you went off for a cup of tea. But now, you just think they appear, and if they don't take a little while to appear, you get irritated. Don't you? It's really weird. You can get irritated quite quickly that the picture isn't appearing. It's just because of what you imagine will happen. It'll happen quickly. You know what I mean? We create a world with our imagination and then get angry with it. I mean, there's much more to say about that, but that's my starter for 10. Yeah.
I was wondering how you link imagination to faith and inspiration.
Yes, that's right. I think again, that's very important, because I think faith and inspiration, Shraddha, as it's, Shraddha, for those of you who are new, means placing the heart upon. It means, some sense of there being more to life. It feels to me that faith, Shraddha, is again what human beings, particularly in the West, need more than ever, anything. And in that sense feels more important than imagination in a way. But I would say one way of understanding it is that it's the imagination in its ascending aspect, or its imagination looking up, you see what I mean? Just as compassion is, as it were, imagination looking down. So when you see someone in suffering, again, the literal observation won't tell you very much. And sometimes if you're alienated enough, you don't notice it. It's weird. Like, I know there was somebody who fell in the street the other day and I was walking past. And there's a wee moment of unreality about it. And you sort of, like you're in a film. And you think, no, hang on, this is actually happening. I need to actually do something. So, you go across. And it was because I can imagine what it's like to fall over. You know what I mean? From the observation, they might be playing, they might do that regularly. You have no idea what's really happening. It's only when you imagine, you think, oh, I know that will hurt, so I need to go over and see how it is. And some people's imagination is so blunted that they don't feel that. So I think Shraddha, faith, is the sort of the most precious element of imagination. So if you think of imagination as the faculty that we're talking about, faith is it in its upward-looking aspect, if you see what I mean, in its ascending aspect. The strange thing about Shraddha faith is that you can't teach it. It's the most important thing that people need to be taught, but you can't teach it. You have to discover it, which shows to me that it's imagination, you see. You have to discover it. That's why we do rituals, to discover that element of imagination, this upward-looking imagination. But to discover it, just to carry on for a little bit and then I'll stop there, to discover it, you need to participate in it, don't you? So you come to a ritual, you could say, we do say, come to the ritual, but if you don't want to take part, that's fine, you can just watch, which is sort of true, but sort of not true. Because we could say the same with meditation, couldn't we? You could say, come to meditation, but if you're a bit uncomfortable, you can just watch. You can start saying that, probably, knowing as we will say that one day. Just come along. If you're not a bit uncomfortable about meditating, just watch. But of course you can't watch meditation, can you? What you could do is you watch people sit down with their eyes closed and it would be frankly boring. Actually, you can't watch puja either. They're saying things and doing things and holding their hands in a certain sort of way. But that's not puja, that's not ritual. The ritual is something that happens in your imagination. is something that you can't see. Most of the important things in life are things you can't see. In fact, the biggest things in life are things you can't see. And so you can't ever watch a ritual, really. You can in a literal sense, but that isn't what a ritual is. And you can tell this because on retreat, usually by about day 4, you actually do a ritual, where you actually feel it in the room. We're now in touch with this thing that we don't even know what a word for it. Imagination is a bit problematic because it restricts it. Faith is a bit religious because it makes it look like God. Don't really have a word for it, but hey, you can feel it. And usually, everybody feels it. And that is a ritual, that's puja. The rest is just the form. We mix up form for what the form is trying to open us to. The form is always a door into something. Whether that's a poem, a ritual, a piece of music, it's a door. You have to go through that door, but it's a door. It's not an end in itself.
I want to ask, is that sort of similar to discipline, of having the sort of turning up every day set to right?
Right, yeah.
You know, or allow, you talked about the ground at one point, that this ascent can come out of.
Yes, I think...
Is that important?
I think the important thing for us is our discipline in a sense. I've been thinking more and more that most of Buddhism, no, that's not true. I tend to exaggerate. Some of Buddhism, an important part of Buddhism is just turning up. Just turning up. I mean, a lot of how your spiritual life will go is just whether you turn up. Whether you turn up here at the centre, whether you turn up in your meditation practice, whether you turn up to friendship. In my own spiritual life, I've been practicing for about 25, 26 years. I'm no great shakes, frankly, but I have turned up. Mostly I've tried to, not entirely, and I could have turned up more, but I have kept on turning up. I'm here rather than at home. I keep turning up. Most of what we do is just turn up and then just try and turn up more deeply. So if I turn up to meet you for coffee, do I just do the usual oiling the social wheels thing, which frankly I find terribly boring. Sorry folks. Or do I try and actually have that communication? Do I say, actually, you know, the other time we met, what about this? You know, how much do we turn up? So I think a lot of Buddhist practice is just turning up more and more. And then once you've turned up deeply, something new comes in. You know, with my communications, I had a talk with a friend recently. I turned up, went for a cafe, because I always want to go for a cafe because it's a nice thing. So I get myself a coffee, I drink too much coffee. That's a nice, pleasurable thing. But still I've got to turn up with this friend, and at first I'm a bit sort of saying the things I usually say, and he is probably as well, and he thinks I'm an order member, so he has to try and please me in some way, and I have to look wise and all this. Gaze into the middle distance for a moment, whereas actually I just can't think what to say, these are things. And that sort of grinds on for a bit, and suddenly something catches your interest. I think probably the other thing is turning up an interest, isn't it? That your interest then suddenly takes you into something substantial. By the end we met, I felt in this illuminated state, and so did he actually. We found something between us that was more than us. But usually, to get there, you have to do quite a lot of work. You have to ask questions you're not very interested in. You have to think, yes, I know I just want to talk about myself, but how about listening to this other person? You have to think, no, Maitreyabandhu, that's just an opinion. How about we just kind of leave that opinion aside for a moment and find out what they actually mean, you know, and so on. You have to do the work. The rest is not our business. There's a great thing from Eliot, doesn't he? He said, for us there is only the trying, the rest is not our business. So I think that's a sort of way of encapsulating this whole discussion and the whole question of imagination. For us there is only the trying, and the rest is not our business.